Hey there, welcome back to Bedtime Story. I know many of you listen to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you settle in, I'd really love to hear where you're tuning in from. And if these stories have been keeping you company at night, leaving a like and subscribing would mean a lot. Now, let's relax, get cozy, take a slow breath, and begin. In this news story, a Valentine's night no one ever forgot. The small town of Hinton sits quietly along the New River in the rugged mountains of southern West Virginia. On the evening of February 14, 2016, a local resident named Thomas Miller prepared for a simple night. He was a 32-year-old mechanic who had lived in the region his entire life without incident. The freezing rain began to fall against the glass of his remote cabin as the sun dipped behind the ridges. Neighbors later reported seeing his porch light flickering through the dense fog that settled into the valley that evening. Investigators never confirmed what drew him toward the edge of the woods during the peak of the winter storm. Dispatch logs from the county sheriff department indicate a call was placed from the Miller residence at 10:42. The operator heard only the sound of heavy wind and the rhythmic ticking of a clock in the background. Two officers arrived at the property 30 minutes later to find the front door standing open to the freezing air. They found a single set of boot prints leading away from the porch and into the thick brush. State records show that Thomas had no history of wandering, and his vehicle remained parked in the gravel driveway. The interior of the home appeared undisturbed, with a warm meal still sitting on the wooden kitchen table. Search teams arrived at daybreak to find the tracks ended abruptly near a limestone outcrop known as the Devil's Throat. Some locals claimed they heard a low humming sound echoing through the trees during the early morning hours. Forensic teams examined the area but found no evidence of a struggle or any secondary sets of footprints. Archived notes from a similar event in 1984 suggest the ground in that area is prone to instability. The official report noted that the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees, which made survival unlikely without proper winter gear. Investigators remained baffled by the lack of physical clues left behind in the fresh snow and frozen mud. A county file from 2009 mentions strange acoustic anomalies reported by hikers near that specific mountain ridge. The records conflict regarding whether these sounds are caused by wind or by underground caverns shifting in the cold. Thomas's family maintained that he was a cautious man who would never venture out into a storm. His disappearance remains an open case with the local authorities, who still conduct occasional sweeps of the deep forest. The town of Hinton remembers that night as a reminder of how quickly the mountains can claim a life. No body was ever recovered, and the mechanic's tools still sit untouched in his quiet workshop. The search expanded to the surrounding hollows, where the terrain becomes nearly impassable for those without deep local knowledge. Volunteers from 3 neighboring counties joined the effort, but the record cold temperatures forced many to retreat by nightfall. State records indicate that air heat signatures were impossible to detect due to the thickness of the hemlock canopy. Some locals claimed that the silence in the woods that week was unnatural, even for a West Virginia winter. Investigators never confirmed if Thomas had any reason to leave his home without his heavy winter coat or boots. The boots he wore were reportedly his lighter work pair, which left shallow impressions in the hardening icy crust. By the 7th day of the investigation, the sheriff department noted several discrepancies in the initial witness statements. One neighbor insisted they saw a second figure standing near the tree line, but the dispatch logs mentioned no intruders. Archived notes from the local historical society describe deep vertical shafts in the limestone that are not on modern maps. These shafts were allegedly used for ventilation during the mining boom of 1922, but were never properly sealed. Records conflict on the exact location of these openings, which makes any ground search extremely dangerous for the recovery teams. The case file remains active, though no new physical evidence has surfaced in the decades since Thomas vanished. A secondary witness named Sarah Jenkins worked as a nurse at the county hospital located 20 miles from the scene. She reportedly told investigators that she saw a man matching the description of Thomas walking near Route 20. This sighting occurred nearly 3 hours after the initial 911 call was placed from the empty cabin in the woods. State records from that night show that the road was completely blocked by fallen timber and deep snowdrifts. Investigators never confirmed how a man on foot could travel that distance through a blizzard in such a short time. Some locals claimed the man she saw was actually a hunter who had been stranded in the same storm. Dispatch logs from 2017 show that a backpack was found by a group of surveyors in a creek bed. The item was heavily weathered and contained a set of keys that belonged to a Ford truck from 2012. Records conflict on whether these keys were ever tested against the vehicle still sitting in the Miller driveway today. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that the backpack was actually dropped there much later than the disappearance date. Forensic analysts found no biological material on the straps or inside the pockets, despite the item being outdoors for years. This piece of evidence only added to the growing list of contradictions surrounding the cold case in West Virginia. The topography of the region around Hinton is famous for its hidden caves and vast networks of underground drainage systems. Investigators never confirmed if the limestone outcrop near the cabin was connected to a larger subterranean complex beneath the ridge. Some locals claimed that they saw lights moving deep within the woods for weeks following the official search suspension. State records indicate no authorized personnel were in the area during those specific nights due to the extreme weather conditions. A county file from 2021 notes that several pets went missing from the same neighborhood that winter. These events were reportedly dismissed by the authorities as typical predator activity common in the Appalachian wilderness. Thomas Miller was described by his coworkers as a man of habit who rarely deviated from his daily mechanical routine. He was 32 years old and had planned to move to a larger city the following spring. Records conflict regarding his mental state during the final weeks leading up to the Valentine's night disappearance in 2016. Some neighbors mentioned he had grown increasingly quiet, while others reported he seemed excited about his upcoming career change. Investigators never confirmed any history of depression or a desire to walk away from his life without a word. The cabin remains empty, and the surrounding forest continues to grow over the paths where he was last seen. A retired state trooper named Robert Vance revisited the site 3 years later to conduct his own private investigation. He reportedly discovered a series of markings carved into the trees roughly 2 miles north of the Miller property line. Archived notes from his journal describe the symbols as geometric patterns that did not match local trail markers or logging codes. Some locals claimed these marks were simply the work of bored teenagers looking to create an urban legend in the woods. Investigators never confirmed if these carvings were fresh or if they had been present during the original search in 2016. The wood was deeply scarred and showed signs of being etched with a very sharp, heavy metallic instrument. State records from 1955 detail a similar disappearance involving a timber scout who vanished in the same square mile. The scout was a 40-year-old veteran who was intimately familiar with the weather patterns of southern West Virginia. Dispatch logs from that era mention a search that lasted for 3 weeks before being officially called off by the governor. Investigators never confirmed a connection between the two cases, despite the identical nature of the footprints ending at the limestone. Some locals claimed that the ridge holds a specific magnetic charge that interferes with compasses and modern navigation equipment. This theory was reportedly tested by a university team in 2018, but the results remained entirely inconclusive. The county file from 2019 includes a testimony from a local pilot who flew over the ridge that winter. He reportedly saw a dark circular patch in the snow where the heat seemed to have melted the ice completely. Records conflict on whether this was a natural thermal vent or something related to the abandoned mining infrastructure below. Investigators never confirmed the coordinates of the patch because the snow covered it again before a ground team could arrive. Archived notes from the Geological Survey state that there are no known volcanic or thermal activities in that part of the state. The pilot insisted that the circle was perfectly symmetrical and roughly 30 feet in diameter according to his altimeter. In the spring of 2022, a heavy flood washed away a portion of the riverbank near the Miller cabin. A local fisherman found a rusted metal box caught in the roots of an old sycamore tree 3 miles downstream. The box reportedly contained several handwritten letters dated from February 14, 1999, but the ink was mostly illegible. Investigators never confirmed if these letters belonged to a previous tenant or were related to the disappearance of Thomas Miller. Some locals claimed the handwriting matched a local schoolteacher who had moved away from the region decades prior to the event. The county file indicates that the box was logged as found property and sits in a storage locker today. Thomas Miller's mother still lives in a neighboring town and refuses to believe her son simply walked into the woods. She reportedly receives phone calls on Valentine's night that consist of nothing but static and the sound of distant wind. Records conflict on whether these calls originate from a local landline or a spoofed digital number from outside the country. Investigators never confirmed the source of the signals because they usually last for less than 5 seconds before the line cuts. Some locals claimed it is a cruel prank played by people who know the tragic history of the Miller family. Archive notes from the telecom provider show that the calls often coincide with local power surges in the valley. The mystery of Thomas Miller remains one of the most discussed cold cases in the history of southern West Virginia law enforcement. No trace of his clothing or personal items has ever been found within the 5-mile radius of the limestone outcrop. State records indicate that the case will remain open until physical remains are identified through DNA testing or dental record comparison. Some locals claimed they still see a light in the window of the cabin during the month of February each year. Investigators never confirmed these reports as the property has been disconnected from the electrical grid for over 7 years now. The mountain stands silent as a monument to a night that changed the small town of Hinton forever. In this news story, true scary stories from quiet February nights. The rural outskirts of Blacksburg, Virginia, experienced an unusually silent stretch of weather during the first week of February 2020. Mark Henderson was a 45-year-old freelance archivist who lived alone in a renovated farmhouse located several miles from the nearest paved road. He moved to the region specifically for the isolation, which allowed him to process large volumes of historical documents without the distractions of city life. Local dispatch logs indicated that the area was under a stagnant high-pressure system, which resulted in nights that were remarkably still and devoid of wind. Mark spent his evenings working in a second-floor office that offered a panoramic view of the dormant fields and the dense tree line beyond the property fence. On the night of February 4th, Mark reportedly noticed a series of disturbances that did not align with the typical behavior of local woodland animals. He was reviewing a county file from 1984 when he heard a sharp metallic tapping sound originating from the exterior of the ground floor windows. State records from that month showed that temperatures remained well below freezing, which often caused the old timber frames of the house to contract and groan. However, the tapping followed a deliberate and repeating sequence that suggested a source with intent rather than a natural environmental shift. Mark remained in his office while the sound moved slowly from the kitchen windows toward the heavy oak door of the main entrance, is less than has-hone. 0 hash is greater than. Investigators later reviewed archive notes from a similar incident that occurred in a neighboring township during the winter of 2012. In that case, a resident claimed that an unidentified individual would stand in the shadows of the porch and tap on the glass with a small stone. County files from 2020 confirm that Mark contacted the local authorities at approximately 11 in the evening to report a potential trespasser on his land. The dispatch logs recorded that he was advised to stay inside and lock all access points until a patrol car could reach his remote location. Mark watched the security monitor in his office, but the infrared cameras showed no heat signatures or movement in the immediate vicinity of the porch. The patrol arrived 30 minutes later and conducted a thorough sweep of the perimeter using high-intensity spotlights to pierce the winter fog. State records indicate that the officers found a series of depressions in the frost that resembled human footprints, but they lacked any discernible tread pattern. Some locals claimed that certain individuals in the region practiced a form of stealth hunting where they wore heavy wool wrappings over their boots to muffle their movement. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the tracks abruptly ended at the edge of the gravel driveway without leading toward the road or the woods. The officers eventually cleared the scene after finding no signs of forced entry or physical damage to the property structure. By the following evening, the silence of the February night returned with an intensity that Mark described as being physically oppressive in his personal journals. He decided to install additional motion-activated lighting around the barn and the rear garden to deter any further unwanted visitors. Reported sightings of a pale figure standing near the tree line had been documented in archived notes from the previous decade, but were never substantiated with photographic evidence. As Mark was adjusting the settings on his laptop, he heard a faint vocalization that sounded like a person whispering his name from the hallway. He checked every room in the farmhouse, but found that he was entirely alone and all the windows remained securely latched from the inside. Records conflict regarding the frequency of these auditory anomalies, as some experts believe the layout of the valley can carry voices over several miles under specific atmospheric conditions. County file from 2009 mentioned that the mineral composition of the local bedrock could cause strange acoustic reflections during periods of extreme cold. Mark reportedly experienced a second night of tapping on the glass, but this time, the sounds originated from the second-floor windows, which were 20 feet above the ground. He retreated to the basement, where he spent the remainder of the night while monitoring the house through his internal security network. Dispatch logs from February 6th show that no further calls were placed by the resident, despite his documented history of reporting disturbances. When a delivery driver arrived at the farmhouse 3 days later, they found the front door standing wide open and the interior lights fully illuminated. State records noted that Mark's vehicle was still parked in the driveway and all of his personal belongings, including his wallet and phone, were found on the kitchen table. Investigators found archived notes in his office that detailed a timeline of the tapping sounds and the specific intervals at which they occurred. A search of the property and the surrounding woods was conducted over a 2-week period, but no trace of Mark Henderson was ever located by the teams. Some locals claimed that he had simply reached a breaking point with the isolation and chose to walk away from his life without a word. The official report remains open, and the house was eventually sold to a family from out of state who reported no unusual activity during their first year of residence. County files from 2022 indicate that the case was transferred to a cold case unit after all forensic leads were exhausted at the site. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping sounds were a prank, a natural phenomenon, or something more targeted toward the previous occupant. The events of that quiet February night serve as a reminder of how easily the silence of the rural landscape can be misunderstood. Mark Henderson remains on the list of missing persons, and the archived notes of his experience are the only evidence that anything unusual ever occurred. During the search of the basement level, investigators discovered a secondary county file from 1976 that had been moved from the upstairs office. This document described a series of disappearances in the Blacksburg area that occurred during the coldest weeks of February over several decades. State records indicated that none of these individuals were ever recovered, and their properties were often found with the doors left unlocked. The archive notes suggested that the incidents were linked by the presence of rhythmic tapping sounds reported by neighbors prior to the disappearances. Forensic teams examined the basement floor and found that the dust layers had been disturbed in a pattern that matched the movement of heavy furniture. No fingerprints other than those belonging to Mark were recovered from the metal filing cabinets or the basement windows. A local historian later provided dispatch logs from 1991 that detailed a similar event involving a retired teacher living in a nearby cabin. This individual had reportedly contacted the authorities to complain about a tall figure that appeared to be mimicking his daily routines from the tree line. Archived notes from the police department showed that the investigation was closed when the teacher moved to a different state without providing a forwarding address. Some locals claimed that the figure was a remnant of a settlement that had been abandoned during the 19th century due to a severe winter. Investigators never confirmed the existence of such a settlement, and the land records from that era remain largely incomplete. The connection between these historical events and the disappearance of Mark Henderson remains purely circumstantial according to state records. The forensic examination of the farmhouse windows revealed that the tapping had left microscopic fractures in the glass that were only visible under specialized lighting. The county file from 2021 noted that these fractures were consistent with a high-frequency vibration rather than a physical strike from a solid object. This data conflicted with Mark's original report of someone using a small stone to tap on the exterior of the house. Investigators searched the local power grid logs to see if a malfunctioning electrical transformer could have caused the vibrations, but the results were negative. State records indicate that the surrounding properties did not experience any similar glass damage or auditory disturbances during the month of February. The source of the energy required to create such precise fractures in the tempered glass remains unidentified by technical experts. The search for Mark Henderson was officially suspended in late March when the spring thaw began to saturate the low-lying areas of the property. Dispatch logs from the final day of the operation noted that the canine units were consistently drawn to a specific section of the limestone cliffs. Archived notes from the Geological Survey team mentioned that these cliffs contained several deep fissures that were not large enough for a person to enter. However, the dogs continued to alert on the openings until the handlers were forced to move them away due to the hazardous terrain. State records from that period show no evidence of human remains or clothing being found near the rock formations. The mystery of the quiet February nights in Blacksburg continues to be a subject of local speculation among those who remember the archivist. In the years following the disappearance, several hikers reported hearing rhythmic tapping while camping in the woods near the old Henderson farmhouse. The county file from 2024 recorded a statement from a group of students who claimed the sound followed them for several miles. Investigators never confirmed these reports as the students were unable to provide a recording of the sounds or a specific location for the source. State records show that the forest in that region is now designated as a protected zone with limited access during the winter months. The archived notes from the Henderson case are still referenced by researchers interested in the acoustic anomalies of the Appalachian foothills. No further evidence has emerged to explain the events of February 2020, and the file remains in the state archives. The final entry in Mark's personal journal mentioned a feeling of intense cold that seemed to permeate the house despite the functioning heating system. He wrote that the silence outside was so absolute that he could hear the sound of his own heartbeat echoing through the walls. County files suggest that this psychological state is common among individuals experiencing long periods of extreme isolation in remote environments. However, the physical evidence of the footprints and the glass fractures continues to challenge the theory of a purely psychological event. Investigators never confirmed if Mark was aware of the 1976 file before he began experiencing the disturbances at the farmhouse. The story of the quiet February nights remains a cold case in the records of the Virginia State Police. In this news story, Washington's small-town horror stories that locals never talk about. Sultan, Washington remains a quiet region where the dense evergreens often hide the heavy morning mist in the early fall. Local residents usually avoid discussing the specific events that occurred near the edge of the Skycomish River during 2015. Records from the county sheriff indicate that several calls regarding unexplained activity originated from a single remote property that year. Investigators reportedly found the circumstances surrounding the inhabitants to be highly irregular based on the available dispatch logs from then. The following account details the documented experiences of three individuals who encountered something they simply could not easily explain. 32-year-old Mark Miller worked as a local timber surveyor who spent most of his days deep within the woods. He lived in a modest cabin with his younger brother David, who was 24 and worked as a seasonal mechanic. Their friend Sarah joined them during the autumn months to help renovate the aging structure before the harsh winter arrived. The group intended to finish the exterior repairs quickly so they could enjoy the isolation of the Washington wilderness. State records show that Mark had lived in the area for nearly a decade without reporting any significant safety issues. They did not realize that their presence on the property had been noted by someone or something in the brush. The dense forest surrounding the property was comprised of ancient cedar trees that effectively blocked out most of the natural sunlight. Archived notes from a previous land survey conducted in 2010 mention that the soil in this region was unusually soft. Mark discovered several sets of deep indentations in the earth that did not match any known wildlife species in the area. Some locals claimed that the property had a history of trespassing issues involving people who lived off the grid nearby. Investigators never confirmed the identity of these individuals because the dense terrain made tracking nearly impossible for the local authorities. The three friends began to feel a distinct sense of being watched from the dark shadows of the towering trees. Dispatch logs from late September 2015 indicate that Mark called the sheriff to report a series of loud metallic bangs. He stated that the noises seemed to originate from the corrugated metal roof of the tool shed behind the main cabin. David reportedly inspected the area with a high-powered spotlight, but he saw no one standing in the immediate vicinity. A county file from 2009 describes similar reports of vandalism that were never solved by the responding patrol officers. Sarah noted in her personal journal that the atmosphere on the property had changed from peaceful to something quite oppressive. They decided to install several motion-activated lights around the perimeter to ensure their safety during the long and dark nights. State records from October 2015 showed that the local power grid experienced several unexplained surges, specifically in the Sultan area. Sarah reportedly found that all of the heavy kitchen appliances had been moved several inches away from the wooden walls. She told the investigators that she heard the sound of slow breathing coming from the other side of her door. Records conflict regarding whether there were any signs of forced entry found by the officers who arrived later that evening. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built on top of an old mining shaft that created strange acoustic effects. The group became increasingly paranoid as they realized that their physical environment was being subtly altered by an unknown force. Archive notes from the county coroner mention a discovery of several dead animals that were arranged in a perfect circle. Mark found these remains near the edge of the clearing where he usually parked his heavy-duty timber hauling truck. Investigators never confirmed if the animals had been killed by a predator or if they were placed there by someone. The county file from 2009 mentions that a previous resident had reported finding similar patterns in the high grass. David reportedly began to suffer from severe sleep deprivation because he heard the sound of footsteps on the porch every night. He described the noise as a heavy dragging sound that lasted for several minutes before fading away into the deep woods. Dispatch logs from November 2015 record a second call regarding a security breach in the lower level of the cabin. David reportedly found the heavy iron padlock on the cellar door had been snapped off with a pair of bolt cutters. He told the deputy that nothing appeared to be missing from the storage area despite the door being left wide open. State records indicate that the officers found no fingerprints on the metal surface of the lock or the door handle itself. Some locals claimed that a group of transients was known to use the abandoned mining tunnels for shelter during the winter. Investigators never confirmed this theory because no one was ever located in the subterranean passages beneath the Sultan Forest area. Sarah reportedly captured a single grainy photograph of a figure standing near the tree line during the early hours of the morning. The image shows a tall and thin shape that appears to be wearing a dark hooded coat with no visible face. Archived notes from the sheriff department state that the photograph was too blurry to provide any useful evidence for a search. Records conflict on whether the figure was a physical person or simply a trick of the light among the tall trees. Mark decided to board up the lower windows of the cabin to prevent anyone from looking inside during the night. The three friends stopped leaving the house after the sun went down because the feeling of being hunted became too intense. The final entry in the county file from 2015 describes a massive disturbance that occurred on the 3rd of December. Dispatch logs indicate that a neighbor heard the sound of glass breaking, followed by several loud screams coming from the property. When the officers arrived, they found the front door standing open, and the interior of the cabin was in total disarray. State records show that a significant amount of blood was found on the kitchen floor, but no bodies were ever recovered. Investigators never confirmed the origin of the biological samples because the DNA profiles did not match any of the residents. Some locals claimed that they saw 3 people walking into the river, but these reports were never verified by the police. A massive search party was organized by the local community members who spent 3 weeks combing through the dense evergreen forest. Volunteers reportedly found a single piece of torn clothing that belonged to Sarah snagged on a thick branch near the river. State records indicate that the search was eventually called off due to the arrival of a severe winter storm that year. The investigators found several items of personal value scattered along a trail that led toward the highest peak in the region. Records conflict regarding whether the items were dropped in a hurry or if they were placed as markers for the police. No trace of Mark or David or Sarah was ever found despite the extensive efforts of the local search and rescue teams. The case remains unsolved in the archive notes of the Washington State Police as a mysterious disappearance with no clear motive. The property in Sultan was eventually sold to a private developer who demolished the cabin and cleared the surrounding forest area. County records from 2021 show that no further incidents have been reported on that specific piece of land since. People who live in the region still avoid the area near the Skycomish River when the heavy morning mist rolls in. They reportedly believe that some secrets are better left buried in the soft soil of the deep and dark Washington woods. The true fate of the 3 residents remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the small town. In this news story, they went into Appalachia during winter and never came back. The Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia are known for their dense forests and unpredictable weather patterns during the month of January. In 2014, 3 experienced hikers decided to trek into the Monongahela National Forest to document the rare winter wildlife. They were reportedly well prepared for the freezing temperatures and heavy snowfall that typically define this region during the winter months. However, local dispatch logs indicate that the group failed to check in at their designated base camp 3 days later. A massive search operation was initiated by state records to locate the missing individuals before the next blizzard arrived. The cold air settled over the mountain peaks as investigators began their difficult journey into the wilderness to find any sign. 27-year-old Mark Stevens was a professional surveyor who spent most of his adult life working in remote locations. He was accompanied by Sarah Miller, a 30-year-old biologist, and her younger brother David, who worked as a photographer. Their primary goal was to reach a specific high-altitude ridge to capture images of the forest under heavy ice. County files from 2014 state that Mark was the primary navigator for the group during this specific expedition. They parked their vehicle at the edge of the forest and began their hike while the sun was still high. Witnesses at a nearby gas station claimed the group appeared confident and focused on their objective for the weekend trip. The first night in the forest was reportedly marked by a sudden drop in temperature that exceeded the initial weather forecasts. Archived notes from the rescue team suggest that the hikers may have struggled to maintain a fire during the night. Investigators found an abandoned campsite located near a steep ravine that showed signs of a very hurried and disorganized departure. Some locals claimed that the terrain in that specific area is prone to sudden shifts in visibility due to thick fog. State records indicate that no distress signals were ever received by the local authorities during the first 48 hours. The lack of communication led many to believe that their equipment might have suffered from a catastrophic failure or battery drainage. Search teams discovered a series of footprints leading away from the primary trail and toward a densely wooded section of the slope. These tracks were partially obscured by fresh snow, which made it difficult for the investigators to determine the exact direction. Dispatch logs from the third day of the search mention a single glove found caught on a low-hanging branch. This item was later confirmed by family members to belong to David, who was known for being very meticulous. Investigators never confirmed if the group was being followed by wildlife or if they had simply become disoriented in the dark. The tracks eventually disappeared entirely at the edge of a frozen stream that ran through the center of the valley. Records conflict regarding the exact location where the last known transmission from Mark's mobile device was pinged by the local tower. One state record suggests the signal came from the ridge, while another county file places it much further down the mountain. This inconsistency hampered the rescue efforts and forced the teams to split their resources across a much larger search area. Reported sightings of lights in the woods were investigated, but these claims were eventually dismissed as reflections from the search team. The atmosphere among the rescuers grew increasingly grim as the temperatures dropped to record lows during the fourth night of searching. Everyone understood that survival in these specific conditions without proper shelter was statistically unlikely for any human being trapped outside. The investigation eventually uncovered a set of archived notes from a previous expedition that had encountered similar difficulties in that same region. These notes described a strange geographical anomaly that often interfered with magnetic compasses and modern electronic navigation equipment during the winter. Some locals claimed that the mountains themselves seemed to shift when the snow was thick enough to hide the main landmarks. Investigators never confirmed these theories, but they did note that the hikers had deviated significantly from their planned path. The physical evidence suggests that the group was walking in circles for several hours before they finally stopped near the ravine. It remains unclear why they chose to leave the safety of their primary campsite in the middle of a storm. A final report issued in 2015 stated that the remains of the hikers were never located despite multiple follow-up searches. The case was officially moved to an inactive status after several months of intensive investigation by state and federal authorities. County files from 2015 contain various testimonies from local residents who believed the mountains simply claimed the three hikers. State records focus strictly on the environmental factors such as the extreme cold and the lack of visibility during the blizzard. There are no official claims of anything beyond natural causes for the disappearance of Mark, Sarah, and David Miller that year. The case remains one of the most significant mysteries in the history of the Monongahela National Forest to this day. The Monongahela National Forest covers nearly 1 million acres of land that remains largely untouched by modern civilization and human development. State records from 2014 describe the area as one of the most rugged and challenging environments in the eastern United States. Hikers are frequently warned about the dangers of the high-altitude ridges and the sudden onset of blinding whiteout conditions. Dispatch logs indicate that the search team had to navigate through several feet of fresh snow during the first week. Every investigator assigned to the case noted that the silence in the forest was heavy and almost physically oppressive during the night. The lack of animal tracks in the vicinity of the camp was another detail that the team found very unusual. Investigators spent several weeks reviewing the personal journals and digital logs that Mark Stevens had left behind in his locked vehicle. These archived notes revealed that he had expressed some minor concerns about the accuracy of his GPS unit before they left. He mentioned that the device was displaying strange readings that did not align with the physical maps he had studied earlier. Sarah Miller also wrote a brief note about the unusual behavior of the local birds as they approached the high ridge. She reportedly observed that the wildlife seemed to be moving away from the area even before the storm had actually arrived. These observations were included in the final county file, but were never linked to any specific cause for their disappearance. The search dogs used by the state police reportedly behaved in a very erratic manner when they reached the frozen stream. One handler mentioned in the dispatch logs that his canine refused to cross the water and began to howl at the trees. The other dogs simply sat down and would not follow the scent any further into the dense thicket across the bank. Investigators never confirmed the presence of any large predators like mountain lions or black bears in that specific sector of forest. Some locals claimed that the area near the stream was avoided by experienced hunters due to the frequent loss of direction. The state records do not provide any scientific explanation for why the dogs suddenly lost the trail at that spot. Thermal imaging cameras were deployed by a helicopter crew during the fifth night of the search to look for heat signatures. The records indicate that several small heat sources were detected near the base of a large rock formation in the valley. However, when the ground teams reached the coordinates, they found nothing but the empty frozen ground and some scattered pine branches. The archived notes suggest that these readings might have been false positives caused by the cooling of the mountain rocks themselves. Dispatch logs from that night record a sense of frustration among the pilots who were flying in very dangerous wind conditions. No further heat signatures were detected during the remainder of the aerial search phase of the operation in 2014. County files from 2016 include a testimony from a local park ranger who claimed to have seen something strange. He reported seeing three figures standing on a distant ridge during a routine patrol several months after the case was closed. When he looked through his binoculars, the figures had disappeared and there were no tracks left behind in the thin snow. State records dismiss this sighting as a visual illusion caused by the distance and the shifting light of the late afternoon. Investigators never reopened the case based on this single report because there was no physical evidence to support the claim. The ranger later resigned from his position and moved away from the region according to the official personnel records. The equipment found at the abandoned campsite was analyzed by a team of experts to determine if it had been damaged. The state records show that the tent had been sliced open from the inside with a sharp blade or a knife. This specific detail suggested that the hikers were in a state of extreme panic when they decided to flee their shelter. Investigators never confirmed what could have caused such a reaction in three people who were so experienced in the wild. Some locals claimed that the sound of the wind in the ravine can mimic the sound of a human voice. Archived notes from the original search team state that the wind was indeed howling at a very high frequency that night. A private investigator hired by the family in 2017 discovered a small digital camera buried in the dirt near the stream. The county file states that the memory card was severely damaged by moisture and the extreme cold of the mountain. Only one image was recovered from the device, and it showed a very blurry view of the forest floor at night. There were no recognizable figures or landmarks in the photograph that could help pinpoint the exact location of the group. Investigators never confirmed if the camera had been dropped or if it had been placed there deliberately by someone else. This piece of evidence was eventually returned to the family after the state police finished their secondary forensic review. The disappearance of the three hikers continues to be a topic of discussion among the residents of the small mountain towns. Some locals claim that the forest has a way of hiding things that do not want to be found by anyone. State records remain focused on the facts of the case, which point toward a tragic accident caused by the weather. There is no mention of any suspicious activity or foul play in the final summary provided by the local authorities. Dispatch logs are still occasionally reviewed by new investigators who hope to find a detail that was missed in 2014. The Monongahela National Forest remains as silent and mysterious as it was the day the hikers first walked into the woods. In this news story, true scary stories of growing up in Appalachia they never warned us about. The Appalachian mountain range contains thousands of square miles of dense forest and deep valleys that remain largely unexplored today. Many residents of these isolated communities prefer to avoid the high ridges and deep hollows when the sun goes down. Jacob Miller was a 25-year-old surveyor who graduated from a technical college in the year 2012. He accepted a contract to map the boundaries of a large timber property located in the heart of Logan County. His objective involved placing physical markers every 50 feet to define the limits of a future logging operation site. State records from 2015 indicate that the project was part of a larger economic development plan for the region. The valley known as Black Hollow earned its name because the steep mountain walls blocked the light for most day. Archived notes from the 1920s describe the area as a place where the air remains cold even in July. Jacob drove his heavy truck through several small towns where the locals watched him with a sense of quiet suspicion. He reached the end of a gravel road and parked his vehicle near a rusted gate that was locked shut. Reportedly, the local utility companies refused to service the hollow due to the frequent equipment failures and the rough terrain. Jacob checked his radio and noted that he was already losing the signal from the nearest tower in the city. State records mentioned that the last official residence in the hollow was a small homestead that burned in 1970. Dispatch logs from that year recorded a series of strange sightings by the fire crews who responded to the scene. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the fire, and the county file from 2009 noted the case closed. Some locals claimed that the fire was set intentionally to drive out a family that refused to sell their land. Records conflict regarding the names of the victims, but the stories of the tragedy persisted in the local folklore area. Jacob ignored the local legends and focused on the technical requirements of the surveying job he needed to finish today. The hike into the center of the hollow took over 2 hours because the undergrowth was thick with thorny vines. Jacob carried a heavy pack filled with iron pins and a sledgehammer along with his digital GPS tracking device unit. He noticed that the forest was strangely quiet, and even the common birds of West Virginia seemed to be absent. The ground was covered in a thick layer of damp leaves that muffled the sound of his heavy leather boots. He reached the first corner of the property and began searching for the original boundary marker from 1924. He found a rusted piece of metal protruding from the base of a massive oak tree that looked very ancient. Jacob set up his tripod and began the process of verifying the coordinates using the satellite data on his screen. He noticed that his GPS unit was fluctuating wildly and gave him readings that were several hundred feet off target. Reportedly, the geological composition of the Appalachian Mountains can sometimes interfere with electronic signals during the summer months here. He decided to rely on his compass and the physical descriptions found in the old county files for his work. A sudden sound of a heavy branch snapping nearby caused him to pause and reach for the bear spray on belt. He scanned the trees but saw nothing except for the swaying leaves and the shifting shadows of the deep forest. As he moved deeper into the hollow, he stumbled upon the remains of a log structure hidden behind some brush. The cabin was built in the style of the early 1900s with a stone chimney that was mostly collapsed. Archived notes from the Historical Society suggested that this was the site of a failed mining office from 2011. Jacob walked toward the open doorway and saw that the interior was filled with rotted furniture and old rusted cans. He saw a series of strange markings carved into the wooden doorframe that looked like a tally of days. Some locals claimed that a hermit lived in this cabin until his disappearance in the winter of 24. He stepped inside the cabin to escape a sudden downpour of rain that began to fall from the gray sky. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old coal smoke, which felt very oppressive in the small, cramped space. He found a handwritten ledger on the floor that contained names and dates from the year 2009. Dispatch logs from that period mentioned a search for a missing hiker who was last seen near this cabin site. Investigators never confirmed if the ledger belonged to the missing man or a squatter who was living in the woods. Jacob took a photo of the ledger and prepared to leave as the rain began to taper off outside now. A low humming sound began to vibrate through the walls of the cabin and caused Jacob to feel very nauseous. He recognized the sound as an acoustic anomaly often reported in deep valleys where the wind hits the rock faces. County records from 2016 include several testimonies from park rangers who experienced similar physical sensations in the area. Jacob walked back into the clearing and saw that his survey tripod had been knocked over on the wet ground. He was certain that he had been alone in the woods, but the damage to his equipment suggested otherwise today. He carefully inspected the area for tracks, but the damp leaves made it impossible to see any clear footprints there. He heard a sharp whistle coming from the ridge above the cabin that sounded exactly like a human signal call. Jacob shouted a greeting into the forest, but the only response was the rhythmic tapping of wood against a tree. Some archived notes from the Regional Forestry Department mentioned that timber poachers used these signals to communicate with each other. He decided to pack his gear and move toward the secondary survey site located on the eastern slope of hill. The feeling of being watched intensified as he climbed the steep terrain and moved away from the old log cabin. He kept his head down and focused on the path while checking his watch every few minutes to track time. He found a series of deep trenches that were dug into the hillside and lined with heavy pieces of plastic. State records from 2003 mentioned that illegal excavations were common in areas with potential for gold or gems. Jacob saw fresh cigarette butts near the edge of the trench, which indicated that someone was here very recently today. He realized that he might be encroaching on an active illegal mining operation that was not authorized by the state. Reportedly, these groups can be very protective of their sites and often use intimidation to keep strangers away from area. He began to back away from the trenches while trying to remain as quiet as possible in the thick brush. He saw a small pile of personal items near a tree that included a pair of child shoes and glasses. The county file from 2009 mentioned that a family vanished from a nearby campsite without leaving a trace. Investigators never confirmed if the items were connected to the missing family or if they were just discarded mountain trash. Jacob felt a surge of adrenaline as he realized the danger of his situation in this remote part of Hollow. He turned to walk back the way he came and saw a figure standing silently on the trail ahead of. The person was wearing a heavy, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face from his view. Jacob stopped and raised his hands to show that he was not a threat to the person on the trail. He explained that he was a surveyor for the state and was only here to map the boundaries of property. The figure did not respond and simply pointed toward the ridge before turning and walking back into the dense trees. Records conflict regarding the presence of any registered residents in this specific section of the Logan County forest land. Jacob waited for several minutes until he was sure the stranger was gone before he continued down the narrow path. He felt his heart racing in his chest as he realized how isolated he truly was from any outside help. The sun began to drop behind the mountain peaks and cast long and distorted shadows across the forest floor today. Jacob knew that he could not navigate the terrain in the dark and needed to find a safe place soon. He found a small rock overhang that offered some protection from the elements and the wind blowing from the north. He sat with his back against the stone and kept his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention to his location. Some locals claimed that the woods come alive at night, with sounds that have no logical explanation for the people. He heard a series of heavy thuds that sounded like someone was dropping large rocks into the deep valley below. He used his flashlight briefly to check his map and saw a trail that was not listed on any document. Archived notes from the 1950s mentioned a secret road used by moonshiners during the era of the Prohibition laws. He decided to follow the trail in the morning because it appeared to lead directly toward the main highway exit. The sound of a metallic scraping began again and seemed to be coming from the woods directly above his head. Jacob stayed awake for most of the night and listened to the strange noises that echoed through the dark hollow. He felt a deep sense of dread that he could not explain despite his professional training and his personal experience. The first light of dawn revealed a heavy mist that clung to the trees and made visibility very difficult today. Jacob gathered his belongings and started walking down the secret trail while keeping a hand on his heavy survey equipment. He found a rusted metal sign that was nailed to a tree and written in a language he did not. Dispatch logs from 2012 recorded a similar report of a strange sign found by a group of local hikers. Investigators never confirmed the meaning of the sign and suggested it was a prank by some local high school students. Jacob reached a clearing and saw his truck parked in the distance, which gave him a great sense of relief. When he reached his vehicle, he saw that the tires had been slashed and the windshield was smashed with rocks. He checked the interior of the truck and found that nothing was stolen, including his expensive laptop and his radio. Reportedly, the act of vandalism was a clear warning to leave the area and never return to the Black Hollow. He used his satellite phone to call for help and waited for the local police to arrive at his location. State records from 2015 show that the police response was delayed by several hours due to a fallen tree. Jacob sat on the ground and watched the forest with a sense of defeat as the rain began to fall. 2 officers from the Logan County Sheriff Department arrived in a heavy 4-wheel drive vehicle to help him today. They took a statement from Jacob and examined the damage to his truck with a look of bored and indifference. The county file from 2009 mentioned that vandalism was common in the remote parts of the mountain range. Jacob told them about the cabin and the figure he saw on the trail, but the officers simply shook heads. Some locals claimed that the police were aware of the illegal activities in the hollow, but chose to ignore them. He felt that they were not telling him everything they knew about the history of the Black Hollow and its residents. The survey project was officially suspended by the timber company 2 weeks after Jacob returned to the main office today. State records from 2016 indicate that the land was sold to an anonymous buyer who requested no further maps. Jacob never received an explanation for the sudden change in plans, and he was assigned to a different project site. He still has the photos of the ledger and the strange markings he found on the door of the cabin. Investigators never confirmed any of his claims, and the case of the vanished family remains an open and cold file. He sometimes thinks about the figure on the trail and wonders if they were trying to help or to hurt. Jacob Miller moved out of West Virginia in the year 2017 to work in the flatter terrain of Ohio. He avoids the woods and the mountains because the sound of breaking branches still makes him feel very uneasy now. Archived notes from the local newspaper mentioned that several more sightings of the figure occurred in 2018 and 19. Records conflict regarding the current status of the Black Hollow, but many people say it is a cursed place today. Jacob knows that the truth is likely much more mundane, but no less terrifying than any ghost or monster story. The Appalachian Mountains will continue to keep their secrets hidden in the deep hollows and the shadows of the forest. Before Jacob entered the woods, he stopped at a small gas station to buy some water and some trail snacks. The elderly woman behind the counter saw his survey maps and warned him to be careful near the old creek. She mentioned that her grandfather used to work in the mines until the day he saw something in the dark. Reportedly, the man never spoke another word for the rest of his life and died in the year 1960. Jacob dismissed her story as a local superstition designed to frighten outsiders who came to work on the mountain today. He now realizes that the warning was based on a very real and present danger that he did not understand. The survey pins were made of galvanized steel and were designed to last for at least 100 years in soil. Jacob recorded the serial numbers of each pin in his logbook to ensure that the data was accurate and verifiable. County records from 2012 showed that many pins from the original 1924 survey were missing or moved. Some archive notes suggested that the movement of the earth was responsible for the displacement of the boundary markers there. Jacob found it hard to believe that nature could move a heavy steel rod several feet without leaving any tracks. He suspected that someone was moving the markers to change the size of the property for their own personal gain. Dispatch logs from 2015 recorded a call from a woman who lived on the edge of the Logan County. She claimed that her dog would bark at the trees for hours every night until it finally disappeared in June. Investigators never confirmed if a predator was responsible or if the dog had simply run away into the deep woods. Jacob thought about this report as he sat in his truck and waited for the police to arrive at site. He wondered if the figure he saw on the trail had anything to do with the disappearance of the local. The silence of the mountain felt like a heavy weight that was pressing down on his chest and his mind. There are many stories like this one that come from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains every single year now. Most of them are dismissed as urban legends or the result of too much isolation in the deep wilderness areas. State records and county files provide a glimpse into the reality of the events, but they never tell the whole. Jacob Miller still dreams of the metallic scraping sound and the feeling of eyes watching him from the dark trees. He will never return to the Black Hollow, and he advises others to stay away from the deep Appalachian woods. The truth remains hidden in the archives and the memories of the few people who were brave enough to enter. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the Hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the Hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing, and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty, and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirmed that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in Courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife Alara and their young daughter Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time. In this news story, something watched our campsite all night in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains hold a history of strange disappearances that the local park rangers rarely discuss with the general public. Griffin Holloway worked as a professional wildlife photographer who specialized in documenting rare bird species in the remote mountain wilderness. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last decade traveling through the most isolated mountain ranges. In October of 1998, he decided to travel to a remote section of the Blue Ridge Mountains area. His goal for the trip was to photograph the rare northern goshawk during its peak migration through the hardwood forest. He arrived at the trailhead during a particularly cold afternoon when the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. Griffin packed his professional equipment, including a heavy tripod and a specialized long lens for his high-end film camera. He hiked 4 miles into the backcountry before he decided to set up a small camp near a stream. The area was quiet, and the nearest paved road was a full day of hiking away from his current location. He built a small fire, and he cooked a simple meal before the sun began to set behind the peaks. As the light faded, he felt a sudden and very distinct sensation that someone was standing just beyond the forest. He turned his flashlight toward the shadows, but he saw only the twisted branches and the thick blankets of moss. Griffin shrugged off the feeling, and he climbed into his sleeping bag to get some rest for the early morning. He woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something heavy moving slowly around the outer perimeter. The movement was calculated and deliberate, as if the intruder was trying to avoid making any unnecessary noise on the protection. Griffin reached for his flashlight, and he sat perfectly still while his heart hammered against his ribs in the dark. He heard a low and gravelly sound that resembled a person trying to clear their throat from a great distance. The photographer slowly unzipped the tent flap, and he peered out into the misty clearing where the fire had died. He saw a pair of pale eyes reflecting the moonlight from behind a large oak tree about 20 feet away. The eyes remained perfectly stationary, and they did not blink even when he shone his bright flashlight directly at them. Griffin felt a surge of adrenaline, and he shouted a warning into the darkness to see if anyone would respond. There was no reply from the woods, and the eyes eventually vanished into the thick undergrowth without making a sound. He did not sleep for the rest of the night, and he kept his knife close to his hand until, when the sun finally rose, he began to inspect the area around his tent for any signs of the visitor. He found a set of tracks that looked like bare human feet, but the toes were unusually long and thin. Griffin decided to conduct a formal investigation by setting up a series of motion-activated cameras around the campsite area. He spent the entire afternoon carefully hiding the lenses behind piles of brush and inside the hollow trunks of trees. He used a specialized high-speed film that was designed to capture clear images in very low light conditions indeed. While he was working, he found a discarded leather glove that did not belong to him near the creek bed. The glove was extremely old, and the leather had been stitched together with a material that looked like dried vine. He placed the glove in a plastic bag, and he made a note of the exact location in his journal. That evening, he did not light a fire because he wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible in the. He sat in his tent with a pair of night vision goggles, and he watched the tree line for movement. At midnight, he saw a group of 3 tall figures emerge from the shadows near the edge of the. They did not move like humans, but they walked with a rhythmic and swaying motion that was very unsettling too. One of the figures approached the spot where he had placed the motion-activated camera, and it stood perfectly still. It reached out a hand that had unusually long fingers, and it gently touched the lens of the expensive camera. The figure was at least 7 feet tall, and it was covered in a layer of matted and gray hair. Griffin realized that these beings were not interested in his food or his supplies, but were curious about his tools. They began to mimic the way he had moved earlier in the day by walking in a slow and deliberate. One of the figures picked up a small rock, and it held the stone to its eye like a camera. Griffin felt a deep sense of dread as he watched the creatures study his behavior with a high level. He realized that they had been watching him since he first entered the woods 3 days ago on the trail. The photographer remained in his tent, and he prayed that the creatures would not decide to enter his small shelter. After an hour of observation, the figures retreated back into the woods, and the forest became eerily silent once again. Griffin waited until the first light of dawn before he gathered his gear and began the long hike back. He moved as quickly as he could, but he constantly looked over his shoulder to see if he was followed. He reached the ranger station in the late afternoon, and he asked to speak with the senior officer on duty. The ranger was a man named Silas Thorne, who had worked in the Appalachian Mountains for over 30 years total. Griffin described the figures and the way they had mimicked his movements during the long night at the remote camp. Silas listened to the story with a grim expression, and he did not seem surprised by the details of the. The ranger explained that there were several reports of these beings dating back to the late 1800s in the Unresolved. He referred to them as the Observers, and he said they were a group of feral people who lived. According to the archives, the Observers did not attack hikers, but they were known for stealing items to use for. Silas showed Griffin a collection of items that had been recovered from abandoned camps over the last few decades of. The collection included rusted cameras and broken binoculars that had been carefully wrapped in animal skins and tied with vines. The ranger warned Griffin that the Observers were becoming more bold and were starting to follow people closer to town. Griffin realized that the glove he found was likely a piece of clothing that the beings had tried to. The photographer returned to his home, but he could not stop thinking about the pale eyes in the dark forest. He processed the film from his motion-activated cameras, and he found several clear shots of the tall gray figures. The images showed the beings standing in a circle and looking directly into the camera lens with a curious expression. One of the figures was wearing the leather glove he had found near the creek bed earlier in the day. Griffin decided to share his findings with a local university professor who specialized in Appalachian history and human behavior. The professor examined the photos, and he suggested that the Observers were a remnant of an ancient and isolated community. He believed that they had lost the ability to speak, but had developed a highly advanced system of visual mimicry. The university launched a small expedition to the area, but they found no trace of the Observers or the. It seemed as though the beings knew they were being hunted, and they had moved deeper into the mountain range. Griffin never returned to that section of the woods, but he still keeps the photos in a locked desk. He sometimes hears a rhythmic tapping on his window at night, and he wonders if they have finally found. The Appalachian Mountains are a place where the past and the present often collide in ways that we cannot understand. Griffin Holloway eventually retired from wildlife photography, and he moved to a quiet town far away from the dark woods. He often tells his story to other hikers as a warning to always be aware of their surroundings. He knows that there are things in the mountains that do not want to be mapped or understood by. The legend of the observers continues to grow, and more people report seeing the pale eyes in the forest. Some people say that the beings are guardians of the wilderness, while others believe they are something much more. The ranger station still keeps a file on the disappearances, but the official cause is always listed as accidental. Griffin believes that the observers are still out there and they are still watching the people who enter the D. He remembers the way the figure held the rock to its eye, and he knows they are still learning. The mountains hold their secrets tightly, and they do not give them up to anyone who is not invited. Every October, he looks at the mountains and he remembers the night he was studied by the Silent Watchers. The investigation into the leather glove revealed that the stitching was made from a rare type of mountain orchid root. This plant only grows in the highest and most inaccessible parts of the mountain range near the rocky peaks. This discovery suggested that the observers had a deep knowledge of the local flora and how to use it. Griffin realized that the beings were far more intelligent than he had initially believed when he first saw them. He spent his final years writing a book about the experience, but he never published the final and most. He died in 2024, and he left his collection of photos to the local historical society in town. The researchers who studied the images found that the observers were often visible in the background of his earlier. It appeared that they had been following him for years before he ever noticed their presence in the dark. This realization changed the way the community viewed the forest and the people who lived in the mountain shadows. The mystery of the Appalachian Observers remains unsolved, and the files are still open at the local sheriff office. The town of Blackwood remains a quiet place, but the residents always lock their doors when the sun goes down. They know that the mountains are not just rocks and trees, but are home to something that is still. Silas Thorne occasionally visits the old trailhead, and he leaves a small gift of fruit or cloth on the day. He says it is a way to keep the peace between the town and the beings who live above. Some people laugh at him, but others bring their own offerings to the edge of the dark and thick. The forest seems to accept these gifts, and the number of disappearances has decreased significantly over the last few. Griffin Holloway is buried in a small cemetery that overlooks the peaks he once loved to photograph so much. His headstone has a small carving of a camera and a single pair of eyes watching from the bottom. People who visit the grave often report feeling as though they are being observed from the trees near the prom. It is a fitting tribute to a man who spent his life looking at things that did not want. The Appalachian Mountains continue to stand tall, and they keep their secrets hidden beneath the canopy of the green. The final recording Griffin made before he left the mountains was a simple description of the silence in the coding. He said that the woods were not truly quiet, but were filled with the sound of 1,000 heartbeats. He believed that the mountain was one large organism, and the observers were its eyes and its long ears. This theory was never proven, but it remains a popular topic among the local hunters and the forest rangers. The film from the motion-activated cameras is now stored in a climate-controlled vault to preserve the images. Many people have tried to find the clearing where Griffin camped, but the trails have changed over the years. It seems as though the mountain has moved the path to protect the beings who live in the shadows. Silas Thorne says that some things are not meant to be found by those who do not belong there. He still patrols the lower trails, but he never goes above the ridgeline after the sun is set. He knows that the observers are still there, and they are still waiting for the next person to. The story of the Appalachian Watchers is a reminder that we are never truly alone when we are outside. In this new story, true scary hiking stories from deep Appalachia. The Appalachian Trail near the town of Damascus, Virginia, remained a favored destination for experienced hikers during the spring of 2016. Thomas Miller was a 32-year-old civil engineer who spent his weekends navigating the more isolated ridgelines of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He arrived at the trailhead with the intention of completing a 40-mile loop through the high country over 3 days. Local dispatch logs indicated that the weather conditions were favorable when Thomas first set out into the dense timber and rocky terrain. The initial stretch of the journey followed a well-marked path that climbed steadily toward the limestone cliffs overlooking the valley below. The forest canopy in this region of the southern mountains was known for its ability to block out almost all natural sunlight even during the midday hours. Thomas noted in his personal logs that the atmosphere felt unusually heavy as he crossed the state line into a less traveled wilderness sector. State records from 2016 show that the local wildlife populations were stable and there were no reports of aggressive bear activity in the vicinity. He reached the first elevation marker by late afternoon and prepared to transition into the deeper drainage basins that defined the central loop. The trail narrowed significantly here as the hardwoods gave way to ancient hemlocks and thick blankets of damp mountain laurel. By the second afternoon, Thomas reportedly reached a section of the forest where the undergrowth became significantly more dense and difficult to navigate. State records from that period noted that several hikers had previously reported feeling a sense of disorientation while passing through this specific drainage basin. He decided to establish a temporary camp near a small creek that was not clearly marked on his primary topographic map. Investigators later found archived notes suggesting that the topography in this region often shifted due to seasonal runoff and minor geological movements. Thomas settled into his tent as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountain range. The temperature dropped rapidly as the shadows stretched across the creek bed and the sounds of the local bird population went completely silent. Thomas started a small fire using dry wood he gathered from the perimeter of his camp to maintain some level of visibility. He felt a persistent sensation of being watched from the dark tree line, but he attributed the feeling to the isolation of the deep woods. Archived notes from a forestry survey conducted in 2012 mentioned that the acoustics in this valley could create strange echoes. Thomas finished his meal and extinguished the fire before retreating into the safety of his reinforced nylon tent for the evening. The silence of the high wilderness was interrupted by what Thomas described as rhythmic thudding sounds originating from the heavy brush nearby. He remained inside his sleeping bag while observing the thin fabric of the tent for any signs of external movement or shadows. County files from 2016 contain a brief statement from a witness who claimed to hear unusual vocalizations in that general area. These accounts were never confirmed by local authorities who searched the site for evidence of large predators or unauthorized human encampments. Thomas stayed awake for several hours while the sounds continued to move in a slow circle around his immediate campsite. At approximately 2 in the morning, the rhythmic thudding stopped and was replaced by the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the rocky soil. Thomas reached for his flashlight, but he hesitated to turn it on because he did not want to reveal his exact position. The dragging sound moved toward the creek and then circled back toward the rear of the tent where his food bag hung. Dispatch logs from that night showed no other hikers were registered in that specific 5-mile radius of the wilderness area. The unknown entity seemed to move with a calculated precision that did not match the typical scavenging patterns of a black bear. Thomas gripped his small folding knife while listening to the sound of heavy breathing just a few feet from his head. As the first light of dawn appeared, the sounds abruptly ceased, and Thomas emerged from his tent to inspect the surrounding perimeter. He reportedly found several heavy stones that had been moved from the creek bed and placed in a straight line near his gear. Some locals claimed that this behavior matched historical reports of territorial displays by individuals living off the grid in the deep woods. Investigators found no physical evidence of footprints or clothing fibers that would link a specific person to the disturbed rocks or noise. Thomas decided to abandon his original plan and began a rapid descent toward the nearest access road several miles away, is less than #. 0 hash is greater than. The descent was complicated by a thick layer of mountain fog that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet in every direction. Thomas struggled to keep his bearings as the trail seemed to weave through sections of the forest that he did not recognize. The county files from 2009 mentioned a similar case of a hiker who became lost when the trail markers vanished. He checked his compass multiple times, only to find that the needle was spinning erratically near certain rock formations in the gorge. This phenomenon was noted in state records as being caused by high iron content in the local subterranean mineral deposits. Thomas pushed forward through the gray mist while hearing the faint sound of snapping branches behind him. The trek back to the trailhead required Thomas to pass through a narrow gorge where the trail was frequently obscured by fallen hemlock trees. He noticed that the trail markers appeared to have been scraped away from the bark of the trees with a sharp instrument. Dispatch logs from that week showed that a maintenance crew had verified the markers were intact only 3 days prior to his arrival. Records conflict regarding whether the damage was caused by environmental factors or intentional tampering by an unidentified individual in the forest. Thomas reached his vehicle in the late afternoon and immediately contacted the local ranger station to report the anomalies. Search teams later surveyed the gorge, but they could not find any tools or evidence of a person residing in that sector. The official report remains open because state records cannot explain the rapid removal of the trail markers over such a large distance. Thomas never returned to that specific region of Appalachia, and he chose to hike in more populated state parks in the years following. The events of 2016 are still discussed by some hikers who frequent the Damascus area, but the facts remain largely inconclusive. Investigators never confirmed the source of the rhythmic sounds or the purpose of the stones moved during the night. The archived notes from the subsequent investigation included a testimony from a neighboring landowner who resided 5 miles from the trailhead. This individual reported seeing unidentified lights moving along the ridgeline during the same 48-hour period that Thomas was in the woods. County files from 2016 do not include any record of authorized search and rescue operations or aerial surveys that would account for the lights. Forensic analysts examined the stones found at the campsite and determined they were sourced from a geological layer located much deeper in the creek bed. This suggested that whoever moved the stones possessed significant physical strength or spent several hours working in total darkness. The case was eventually moved to an inactive status due to a lack of actionable evidence or criminal complaints. State records from 2017 indicate that 2 more hikers reported similar encounters with rhythmic thudding and rearranged forest debris in the same drainage basin. Neither of these individuals were able to provide a visual description of the entity or person responsible for the disturbances. Local law enforcement increased patrols near the Damascus access points for several months, but no unauthorized residents were ever located. Dispatch logs from that period show a series of noise complaints that were dismissed as wind whistling through the limestone caverns. The archive notes conclude that while the experiences were consistent, they lacked the physical proof required for a formal intervention. Thomas remains one of the few witnesses who provided a detailed timeline of the events from that spring weekend. Investigators later reviewed old county file from 2009, which detailed a missing persons case in the same northern sector of the trail. A 24-year-old botanist named Sarah Jenkins had disappeared while collecting plant samples near the limestone gorge. Search and rescue logs from that year indicated that her camp was found completely undisturbed, with all of her gear intact and functional. The only anomaly noted in the state records was a collection of river stones arranged in a geometric pattern inside her tent. Canine units were unable to pick up a scent trail, and the case was eventually labeled as a cold file due to a total lack of physical leads. Thomas noted that the arrangement of stones he found bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions in the archive notes from 2009. Reported sightings of a tall, gaunt figure in the periphery of the woods began to surface in local community forums shortly after the incident with Thomas. These accounts remained largely anecdotal, as no photographic evidence was ever produced to support the claims of the residents. Dispatch logs from 2018 mentioned a series of unexplained thefts from local homesteads involving only heavy iron tools and basic survival supplies. Investigators searched the higher elevations for any signs of a primitive shelter, but the terrain proved too treacherous for a sustained ground operation. Some locals claimed that an individual had been living in the deep caverns beneath the gorge for several decades without detection. These theories were never confirmed by geological surveys, which indicated the cavern systems were mostly inaccessible to human beings. By the winter of 2019, the region was hit by a record-breaking snowstorm that effectively sealed off the Damascus trailhead for several weeks. When the snow melted, local rangers found that a significant portion of the old-growth forest had been marked with the same deep scrapings Thomas reported. County files documented that the scrapings reached heights of nearly 10 feet on some of the larger oak trees in the gorge. This data conflicted with the theory of a typical human vandal, as no ladders or climbing equipment were found in the vicinity. Archived notes from the forestry department suggested that the marks could have been caused by falling ice or wind-blown debris during the intense storm. However, the precision of the marks led many to believe that the cause was intentional and directed toward the existing trail infrastructure. The case remains a point of contention among local historians and wilderness enthusiasts who frequent the southern Appalachian Range. State records continue to list the area as a high caution zone for solo hikers due to the persistent history of unexplained mechanical failures and navigational errors. Thomas Miller eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where he continued his engineering career, but he reportedly stopped hiking in deep wilderness entirely. He maintained that the sounds he heard in 2016 were not those of a person or an animal he could identify. The mystery of the Damascus Gorge continues to produce occasional reports of rhythmic thudding and rearranged stones to this day. Investigators never confirmed a suspect, and the woods remain as silent and observational as they were during that spring weekend in 2016. In this new story, a missing hiker case that changed a small West Virginia town forever. Small mountain communities often keep their secrets tucked away in the dense woods until a single person goes missing suddenly. The quiet town of Blackwood sat right on the edge of the Monongahela forest, where the trees grew very thick. Silas Thorne had worked as a lead ranger for the National Forest for over 25 years in West Virginia. He knew every single acre of the rugged land, and he respected the dangers that lived within the deep shadows. The autumn of 1994 brought a sudden cold snap that turned the green leaves into brittle brown shapes. A freelance cartographer named Elias Vance arrived in the town during the first week of October to map the ridge. Elias was 28 years old, and he had a reputation for being extremely thorough with his topographical surveys lately. He checked into the Pinecrest Motel and told the manager he would be back before the first heavy snow. Silas met the young man at the ranger station to provide him with the necessary permits for the backcountry. Elias carried a heavy pack filled with expensive survey equipment and enough food to last him for at least 10 days. He planned to hike toward a remote area known as Dead Man's Drop, which few people ever bothered to visit. Silas warned him that the weather could turn dangerous quickly, but Elias just smiled and said he liked the solitude. The young man seemed very confident in his abilities, and he possessed a map that was incredibly detailed and old. Silas watched the cartographer disappear into the tree line, and he felt a strange sense of unease in his chest. The first week of the expedition passed without any issues, and the weather remained remarkably clear and quite sunny for October. Elias was expected to return to the town by the 20th of the month to submit his preliminary survey findings. When the 21st of October arrived without any sign of the young man, the motel manager contacted the authorities. Silas organized a search party consisting of local volunteers and several experienced deputies from the nearby sheriff office in town. They started their investigation at the trailhead, where the old blue truck belonging to Elias was still parked and abandoned. The vehicle was covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and the interior appeared to be completely undisturbed by anyone. Silas found a set of spare keys hidden in the wheel well, and he opened the door to check the glove box. Inside, he found a journal that contained several entries about the unusual geological features of the northern ridge and the cliffs. Elias wrote that the compass readings in the area near Dead Man's Drop were becoming increasingly erratic and very difficult. The search party began the long hike into the wilderness, while a light rain started to fall from the gray clouds. They followed the marked trail for 3 miles before they reached the point where Elias had planned to go off. Silas noticed that the undergrowth in this part of the forest was unusually thick, and it looked very dark indeed. The searchers moved in a grid pattern, and they shouted the name of the missing man into the cold mountain air. They found the first significant clue near a shallow creek about 5 miles into the dense and very unforgiving mountain brush. A bright orange survey marker was tied to a low branch, but it had been shredded by something with claws. Silas knelt down to examine the damp ground, and he noticed several deep impressions that did not look like footprints. These marks were elongated, and they seemed to sink deep into the mud, as if the creature was very heavy. The search party pushed deeper into the wilderness as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon of peaks. They reached the base of Dead Man's Drop just as a light dusting of snow started to coat the ground. One of the volunteers shouted when he spotted a dark shape huddled beneath a natural rock overhang near the cliff. It was the heavy backpack that belonged to Elias Vance, but the young man was nowhere to be found nearby. Silas approached the pack with caution, and he noticed that the straps had been sliced with a very sharp blade. The contents of the bag were scattered across the frozen ground, and it looked like someone had been searching through. Silas gathered the items, and he found that most of the food was still inside and neatly wrapped in plastic. The most important discovery was a small handheld cassette recorder that Elias used to take notes while he was working. Silas pressed the play button and listened to the voice of the young man as it echoed through the air. The early recordings were standard descriptions of rock formations and elevation changes that sounded very professional and quite calm indeed. However, the tone of the voice changed significantly on the final entry, which was dated October the 14th of that year. Elias sounded breathless, and he whispered into the microphone about a cabin that was not supposed to be on maps. He described a structure made of gray stones that seemed to blend perfectly into the side of the steep mountain. According to the recording, the cabin had no windows and the heavy wooden door was sealed shut with iron bolts. Elias said he heard a rhythmic tapping coming from inside the stone walls that sounded like a person using hammers. He decided to wait nearby to see if anyone would come out of the strange building before the sun set. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic clatter and the sound of heavy boots running over very dry leaves. The search party spent the next 2 days looking for the stone cabin, but they found absolutely nothing in area. Silas studied the topographical maps and realized that the coordinates Elias mentioned led to a sheer cliff face with no ledge. He returned to the site where they found the backpack and began to clear away the snow with his hands. He discovered a series of narrow grooves carved into the rock that looked like they had been made by fingers. These grooves led toward a hidden crevice in the mountainside that was barely wide enough for a man to enter. Silas squeezed through the opening and found himself in a small, natural cavern that felt surprisingly warm despite the weather. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of the surrounding forest and detailed maps of the town of Blackwood below. In the center of the cave sat a pile of survey equipment that had been smashed into hundreds of pieces. Silas found a final notebook page tucked into a crack in the stone wall that contained a single sentence. It stated that the mountain was not made of rock, but of something that was still breathing and hungry. The search for Elias Vance was officially called off after a massive blizzard buried the entire ridge under snow. Silas spent his final days as a ranger reviewing the dispatch logs from the night Elias recorded his final message. He discovered that several residents of Blackwood had reported hearing a strange rhythmic tapping coming from the floorboards of homes. These reports were dismissed at the time as settling foundations or the sound of woodpeckers in the nearby forest trees. Silas realized that the tapping Elias heard in the mountains was the same sound that was haunting the town below. He revisited the cavern one last time before he retired, but the entrance had been sealed by a rock slide. The maps that Elias had drawn on the cave walls suggested that the mountain was slowly expanding toward the town. Silas noticed that the distances between the trees near the trailhead were slightly different than they were 10 years ago. It seemed as though the earth itself was stretching and moving in a way that defied all known laws of. The disappearance of the young cartographer remained a cold case, and the files were eventually moved to a dusty basement. The town of Blackwood tried to move on from the tragedy, but the residents never quite felt safe in homes. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the local sheriff noticed an increase in reports of strange tapping sounds. The town of Blackwood was never the same after the disappearance of the young man who came to map Wilderness. People started locking their doors at night, and parents told their children to stay away from the edge of woods. Silas Thorne retired from the Ranger Service a year later because he could not stop thinking about the rhythmic tapping. He moved to a different state, but he still kept a copy of the final recording in a desk. Some of the locals claimed they saw a figure watching the town from the high ridges during the cold months. These witnesses described a tall man who carried a survey pole and moved with a strange and very jerky gait. No body was ever recovered, and the stone cabin remained a mystery that the mountain refused to give up. The disappearance of Elias Vance became a local legend that served as a grim reminder of the power of nature. Some things are simply not meant to be mapped or understood by the people who live in the world. The Monongahela forest continues to grow over the old trails, and the secrets of the ridge remain buried in time. Silas often wondered if Elias was still out there somewhere tapping on the stones of a cabin that lived. He knew that some mysteries are better left alone in the dark corners of the world where the wind. The case remains open in the dusty files of the sheriff's office, but no new evidence has ever been. Every October, the people of Blackwood remember the cartographer who vanished into the Gray Mountain, and they stay inside. The forest grew thicker around the old ranger station, and the trail to Dead Man's Drop was eventually closed forever. Silas occasionally received letters from old friends in Blackwood who claimed the mountain was appearing closer to the town center. They sent photographs of the horizon that showed the jagged peaks towering over the rooftops in a very threatening way. Silas looked at his old maps, and he realized that the town of Blackwood was no longer where it started. The entire valley had shifted several miles to the north, according to the latest satellite imagery and the local surveys. He remembered the charcoal drawings in the cave, and he realized that Elias had been trying to warn the town. The breathing that the cartographer mentioned was not a metaphor, but a literal description of the earth beneath their feet. Silas finally burned the final recording and the notebook page because the sound of the tapping was becoming too loud. He spent his remaining years in a quiet house far from the mountains where the ground was flat, and the mystery of the vanishing hiker remains one of the greatest unexplained events in the history of the small town. People still whisper about the man who tried to map the heart of the mountain and found something else. The stone cabin is still out there waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon its cold and windowless walls. In this new story, home alone during a snowstorm, then someone knocked. The winter of 2018 brought a historic blizzard to the Catskill Mountains that stranded many residents for several days. 24-year-old Emily Vance was a freelance graphic designer who had rented a remote cabin to finish her work. She reportedly planned to stay for 14 days, but a heavy snowstorm began to bury the house on the third night. According to dispatch logs from the Sullivan County Sheriff, she made a call regarding an unidentified visitor late that same evening. County files from 2018 indicate that the cabin was located miles away from the nearest neighbor in a dense forest. Emily had stocked up on supplies because she didn't want to leave the property until her big project was finally finished. The electricity reportedly failed around 10 o'clock at night as the wind speeds reached 50 miles per hour outside the cabin. She used a small kerosene lamp to light the living room while she listened to the sounds of the heavy wooden structure. A state record mentions that the temperature inside the home dropped to 40 degrees within just a few hours of the outage. Emily was huddled under several blankets when she first heard a soft, rhythmic tapping against the heavy oak front door that night. She initially dismissed the sound as a tree branch because the storm was shaking the entire foundation of the small mountain cabin. However, the knocking became much louder and more deliberate, as if someone was trying to get her attention through the thick wood. Dispatch logs from that evening show that Emily called the local authorities at exactly 11:22 to report a suspicious person. The operator reportedly told her that no patrol cars could reach her location until the snowplows cleared the main access road. Emily grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and moved toward the window to see if anyone was standing on the covered front porch. The glass was completely covered in thick frost, which prevented her from seeing anything beyond the blurry reflection of her own face. The The sound of the knocking suddenly moved from the front door to the back of the house near the small kitchen area. Emily reportedly felt a sense of dread because the back door was much thinner and the lock wasn't as secure as before. She stayed in the middle of the room because she didn't want to be near any of the large glass windows or doors. The operator could hear the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the house while Emily was still on the phone. State records described this sound as a blunt impact that was strong enough to shake the kitchen cabinets and rattle the plates. Archived notes from the following investigation state that the knocking continued for nearly 20 minutes without any verbal response from outside. Emily shouted through the door, but she didn't hear any voice over the sound of the wind screaming through the frozen trees. Some locals claimed that a drifter had been seen walking along the highway several miles south of the cabin earlier that day. Investigators never confirmed the identity of this individual or if they had the equipment to survive in such a brutal winter storm. The state records indicate that the footprints found later were far too large to belong to any of the local forest residents. Records conflict regarding whether the front door had been tampered with or if the locks were simply frozen shut from the ice. Morning light revealed a strange scene that the investigators would later document in a detailed county file from 2019 for court. There were no human footprints in the deep snow surrounding the cabin, despite the clear reports of someone circling the entire perimeter. Instead, the search team found deep, circular indentations in the ice that didn't match any known footwear or local wildlife in New York. Some locals claimed that the pressure of the frozen ground can sometimes create unusual patterns during a very rapid change in temperature. Investigators never confirmed this theory because the marks were concentrated specifically around the entry points of the remote mountain home during the storm. Archived notes from the lead detective suggest that someone might have used stilts or another device to avoid leaving recognizable human tracks. The investigation turned to the history of the property, which had been built on an old logging site from the 1950s. County files indicate that the land had been the subject of many legal disputes regarding the boundaries of the neighboring state park. A state record from 2012 mentions a similar incident where a previous tenant reported hearing rhythmic knocking during a heavy rainstorm. Some locals claimed that the cabin was built over a natural vent that produced strange acoustic effects when the wind was strong. Investigators never confirmed if the sound of the knocking was a physical person or just a very rare environmental phenomenon of nature. Records conflict about whether the previous tenant had actually seen a figure standing in the woods before they decided to move out. Emily decided to leave the cabin immediately after the roads were cleared because she didn't feel safe staying there any longer alone. She reportedly told the investigators that she felt like someone was watching her from the tree line as she packed her car. Dispatch logs from the following week show that she called once more to report a strange vehicle parked at the gate entrance. When the deputies arrived, they found a set of archived notes sitting on the passenger seat of an abandoned and rusted truck. These notes belonged to a former surveyor who had disappeared in the same region during a similar winter storm in 2011. State records describe the surveyor as a very experienced man who knew the mountain trails better than almost anyone else in the county. The discovery of the abandoned truck led the investigators to believe that the two cases might be connected by a single individual. However, there were no signs of life inside the vehicle, and the engine had been cold for at least several months already. Some locals claimed that they had seen the old truck moving through the woods at night without any of its headlights turned on. Investigators never confirmed these sightings because the mechanical condition of the vehicle made it impossible for it to be driven by anyone. County files from 2019 show that the truck was registered to a man who had passed away over 10 years earlier. This data conflict caused a lot of confusion for the detectives who were trying to find a logical explanation for recent events. Emily moved back to the city, but she reportedly continued to have nightmares about the rhythmic knocking on the heavy oak door. She couldn't forget the way the house shook or the feeling that something was trying to find a way inside the warm cabin. Dispatch logs reveal that several other residents in the Catskill Mountains reported similar sounds during the remainder of the winter of 2018. Every report mentioned the same pattern of knocking, followed by a period of silence and then a heavy blow against the walls. State records never identified a suspect or a group of people who might have been responsible for these strange and terrifying events. The case remains an open file in the county office because the physical evidence doesn't support a clear conclusion for the record. The archived notes from the surveyor's truck contained several maps of the region with specific locations marked with a small red circle. One of these circles was located exactly at the coordinates of the cabin where Emily had been staying during the winter blizzard. State records indicate that the surveyor was investigating reports of strange ground vibrations that were occurring deep within the mountain forest area. He reportedly believed that these vibrations were caused by a hidden geological feature that had never been properly documented by the government. Some locals claimed that the sounds were much more frequent during the winter months when the ground was frozen and the air thin. Investigators never confirmed the existence of any such feature because the terrain was too dangerous to explore with the heavy drilling equipment. County files from 2020 include a summary of the forensic evidence found on the exterior of the mountain cabin after the snow. The siding of the house showed signs of being struck by a flat object with a surface area of approximately 4 inches. These marks were located nearly 7 feet above the ground, which is much higher than a person could reach without a ladder. Dispatch logs from the search team mention that no ladders or large tools were found anywhere on the property during the sweep. Investigators never confirmed if the marks were made by a tool or by a biological entity that possessed a very high reach. The state records focus on the possibility of falling ice chunks from the roof, but the pattern of the marks was consistent. Emily's lawyer reportedly requested a copy of the archived notes to see if there was any mention of a specific person nearby. The county files mention a recluse who lived in a cave system several miles away, but he had a very solid alibi. Records conflict regarding the exact location of this individual during the night of the blizzard when the knocking first began at door. Some locals claimed that the recluse was a peaceful man who didn't have any reason to harass a stranger in the winter. Investigators never confirmed his involvement, and he eventually stopped cooperating with the local sheriff's department after the first few rounds of questioning. The lack of a clear suspect made it impossible for the state to file any formal charges in the case of Emily. A final review of the dispatch logs from 2018 revealed a third call that had been dropped due to poor signal. In this short recording, Emily sounded much more panicked, and she mentioned seeing a shadow moving across the frosted glass of window. She reportedly said that the shadow was too thin to be a person, and it seemed to glide rather than walk on. Investigators never confirmed the presence of such a figure, and they attributed the sighting to the high stress of the dangerous situation. State records indicate that the cabin was sold later that year to a developer who planned to tear it down and build. The new owner reportedly found a collection of small stones arranged in a circle on the porch after the first light snow. These stones were perfectly smooth, and they didn't match any of the rocks found in the immediate vicinity of the property. County files from 2021 state that the new owner decided to abandon the project and sell the land back. He didn't provide a specific reason for his decision, but he mentioned that the atmosphere of the forest felt very unwelcoming. Some locals claimed that the mountain has a memory of the things that have happened there over the many long years. Investigators never confirmed these claims because they don't deal with the legends or the local folklore of the rural mountain regions. The archived notes from the original case are now kept in a secure storage facility in the city of Albany for reference. Emily now lives in a high-rise apartment building in a different state, where she feels much safer behind layers of security. She still checks the locks on her doors every single night before she goes to bed because she can't forget sound. Dispatch logs from her new neighborhood show that she has never called the police since she moved away from the Catskills. However, she reportedly keeps a small lamp burning in the hallway to remind her that she is no longer alone in dark. State records from New York show that the cabin was eventually reclaimed by the forest as the roof collapsed under snow. No one has lived on that specific piece of land since the events of 2018 when the knocking began during storm. The state records from 2022 describe a discovery made by a team of scientists who were studying the soil. They found a series of metallic fragments buried near the foundation of the old cabin that were composed of a rare, Archived notes from the laboratory state that the fragments showed signs of extreme heat exposure despite being buried in the ground. Investigators never confirmed where the metal came from or if it had any connection to the sounds Emily heard during Blizzard. Records conflict about whether the fragments were part of an old industrial machine or if they belonged to something much more. Some locals claimed that the area had been used for clandestine military testing during the 1970s, but this was never verified. County files indicate that the metallic fragments were located exactly beneath the spot where the heavy knocking had been reported by tenant. The soil in that specific area was reportedly devoid of any life, including the typical insects and fungi found in forest. Dispatch logs from the environmental team record a sense of unease as they worked near the ruins of the collapsed cabin. One of the scientists reportedly mentioned that his electronic sensors were malfunctioning whenever he approached the center of the old building. This data conflict led to a temporary halt in the research project until the equipment could be properly shielded from interference. Investigators never confirmed the source of the magnetic field that was causing the sensors to display such erratic and unpredictable data. The archived notes from the surveyor who disappeared in 2011 were re-examined by a specialist in the state police. These notes contained a drawing of a strange structure that he had found hidden deep within a narrow crevice in rocks. The drawing depicted a series of metallic poles that were arranged in a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the indentations. Some locals claimed that they had seen similar poles while hiking in the more remote sections of the mountain forest years. Investigators never confirmed the existence of this structure because the surveyor had not provided the exact coordinates in his personal. State records from 2023 show that the case remains officially unsolved despite the new evidence found by research team. The mystery of the knocking during the snowstorm of 2018 continues to haunt the people who live in Catskills. Dispatch logs are still analyzed by amateur investigators who believe they can find the one detail that the police managed to overlook. Every winter, when the snow begins to fall and the wind starts to howl, residents are reminded of the story. They reportedly make sure to check their locks and stay away from the windows when they hear a tapping sound. County files from 2024 list the area as a restricted zone due to the potential dangers of terrain. Investigators never confirmed if the danger was purely physical or if there was something else that the state wanted hidden. In this new story, people who went into West Virginia's woods and never came back. Many hikers believe that the deep forests of the Appalachian Range are just quiet places for weekend camping trips today. There are stories in the West Virginia mountains about travelers who walked into the trees and simply vanished forever now. This documented account follows a professional geologist who discovered a remote campsite that should not have existed at all. Gideon Vance was a 46-year-old hydrogeologist who specialized in mapping underground springs in very remote areas. He was known for his calm personality and his ability to survive in the wilderness for several weeks alone. In the spring of 2022, Gideon was hired to survey a valley near the edge of the forest. The local residents warned him about a specific ridge where the compass needles often spun in circles without any reason. Gideon did not believe in local superstitions, and he focused on the scientific data provided by his expensive digital tools. He packed his waterproof gear and hiked deep into a canyon where the cell phone signals were completely non-existent. The equipment in his heavy pack included a laser level and a high-precision digital watch that used satellite signals. He carried enough food for 7 days and a small weatherproof logbook to record his various scientific observations daily. The air in the canyon was heavy and smelled of damp moss and the ancient stone of the rising mountain. On the second morning of his trip, Gideon reached a clearing that was not marked on any of his maps. He found a canvas tent that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, sitting near a cold stone fire. There were no modern items like plastic bottles or synthetic fabrics anywhere near the small and very quiet campsite. He called out to see if anyone was nearby, but the only response was the sound of the wind through. Gideon approached the tent and noticed a cast iron skillet sitting on the rocks with fresh bacon grease inside it. He felt a sudden chill even though the sun was shining brightly over the high ridges of the deep valley. Inside the tent, he found a wooden crate containing supplies and a tattered leather journal with yellowed and fragile pages. The handwriting was neat and described a hiking trip taken by two brothers in the summer of 1954. He noticed that the local wildlife seemed unusually quiet, which was a detail he noted in his small weather logbook. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his ears as he turned the brittle pages of the old book. The final entry was dated June 12th and mentioned a strange humming sound coming from the rocks nearby that morning. Gideon looked at the ground and saw a pair of leather boots that looked brand new despite the vintage style. He picked up a newspaper from the crate and saw the headline was from the year 1954 today. He heard a branch snap behind him and turned to see two men wearing heavy flannel shirts and denim pants. The men looked confused and asked Gideon why he was wearing such strange and brightly colored synthetic hiking clothes today. They explained that they had only been camping for 2 days and were waiting for their father to return soon. Gideon realized with a shock that these men matched the descriptions of two brothers who disappeared 70 years ago today. He checked his watch and noticed that the date on his digital screen was now flickering between different years rapidly. The brothers, whose names were Alistair and Emmett, noticed the laser level on his tripod and backed away in terror. Gideon tried to explain that he was a scientist, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He felt a sense of overwhelming vertigo, as if the ground beneath his boots was turning into a gray mist. He ran back toward the main trail and did not look back at the clearing or the two lost brothers. The woods looked different in the fading light, and every tree seemed to shift its position when he turned now. When he reached his truck, he found that the police were already there searching for a missing man named Gideon. The officer named Dalton Grady told him that he had been missing for over 3 weeks in the deep woods. Gideon felt like he had only been away from his vehicle for 2 hours before he reached the main road. He checked his pack and found the leather journal from 1954 sitting right on top of his maps. The final page now had a new entry that described a man in bright orange clothes who visited their camp. Gideon never returned to that part of the West Virginia forest, and he left the geology profession shortly after that. He still dreams about the humming sound in the rocks and the smell of the fresh bacon in the woods. The mountains of West Virginia continue to hold their secrets in the deep places where time does not always move. Some structures are not built of wood and stone, but are woven into the very fabric of the passing years. If you find yourself lost in the woods near the border, you should probably keep moving until the sun comes. The ending of the tale sounds fake until you see the journal and the date written in your own hand. The truth is a shadow that follows you home from the woods and stays with you until the very end. This event remains one of the most puzzling cases in the archives of the local search and rescue teams today. Witness statements from the family members of the missing brothers confirm that the handwriting in the journal is perfectly authentic. The police files include photographs of the campsite that Gideon found, but the clearing was empty when they arrived there. They found no tent and no fire and no signs of the two brothers who had been seen by Gideon. The only evidence left behind was the journal that Gideon had taken from the wooden crate during his initial discovery. Forensic analysis of the paper showed that it was manufactured in the early 1950s, but it showed no aging. The ink was still fresh, and the leather binding had not yet developed the cracks typically found on antique books. Geologists who studied the canyon reported that the rock formations contain unusual magnetic properties that might affect local electronic devices. Some researchers believe that the humming sound Gideon heard was a result of geological pressure deep within the mountain range. Others suggest that the canyon is a place where different eras overlap for a few minutes when the weather changes. Gideon Vance spent several years trying to understand the physics of his experience, but he never found a clear answer. He often visits the county library to look at the missing persons files from the middle of the last century. He found a report about Alistair and Emmett that mentioned they were last seen carrying a heavy canvas camping tent. The photograph in the file showed two young men who were the exact same people Gideon met in the clearing. Their father had also disappeared that same week and was never found by the police or the local search parties. The case remains officially open because the bodies of the brothers were never recovered from the deep and dark woods. Gideon believes that the brothers are still in the canyon waiting for their father to return to their small camp. He often wonders if they saw him as a ghost from the future or a demon from another world entirely. The memory of their confused faces stays with him, and he can still hear their voices in his quiet mind. The forest has grown over the trails that lead to that specific coordinate, and the maps are no longer accurate. The government has restricted access to the valley, citing environmental concerns and the danger of the steep and rocky terrain. Most people who live in the area avoid the mountain and tell their children to stay away from the trees. They know that the woods can take a person and hold them for 70 years without letting them grow old. The silence of the mountain is a warning to those who think they can master the secrets of the wild. If you hear a humming sound in the rocks, you should turn around and run as fast as you. Do not look for the clearing and do not speak to the men who are wearing the flannel shirts today. The past is a dangerous place, and it does not always let you return to the present day in one fort. The ending of the story is the part that stays with you when you are walking alone in the night. The mystery is the heart of the wild, and the heart of the wild is a cold and dark. Gideon Thorne is the only witness to a truth that science cannot explain or even begin to understand fully now. The archived dispatch logs from the night of his return record a man who was terrified of his own watch. The officers who processed the report noted that Gideon appeared to have aged several years in just a few weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spoke in a hurried whisper about a camp that did not exist on maps. They took his statement and filed it away with the other unexplained reports from the Appalachian mountain range this year. The journal is kept in a safe at the university where researchers occasionally study the strange and fresh ink. No one has been able to reproduce the magnetic conditions that Gideon described in his detailed and very professional notes. The mountain continues to stand over the valley, and the fog still rolls through the trees in the morning. Some say the brothers are still there, and they are still waiting for the sun to go down today. The story of the surveyor is a warning to those who believe that time is a straight and simple line. It is a loop that can catch you and hold you in a moment that never ends or begins. The woods of West Virginia are deep, and they are very old, and they do not like to be. The ending of the story sounds fake until you stand in the fog and hear the sound of the rocks. The truth is in the journal, and the journal is in the safe, and the safe is in the forest is waiting for the next person to lose their way in the mist of the high ridges. The tale is told, and the listener is warned, and the cabin is waiting in the deep and dark. The story of Gideon Vance is a legacy of the unknown in the heart of the great American wild. The ending is the part that stays with you when you turn off the light at the end day. The mystery is the ending, and the ending is the mystery in the quiet woods of the mountain range. The story is finished, and the forest is dark, and the mountains are silent, and the truth is free. The geologist is home, and the camp is gone, and the brothers are waiting for their father to return soon. The ending is the beginning of the next story, in the heart of the great and ancient mountain wild. The tale of the man who saw the past in the present is done for now in the woods are calling, and the fog is rolling, and the mystery is yours to keep for a long. The ending is the silence that follows the final word of the story of the lost and the truth. The truth is a shadow in the trees, and the trees are the only ones who know the secrets. The story is done, and the fire is out, and the dark is all that remains in the fire. The forensic evidence of the journal remains the only physical proof that the brothers were ever seen after 1954. Handwriting experts compared the new entry to the older pages and found they were written by the same person. This would mean that the boy from the past wrote about Gideon in the future with the same pen today. The local sheriff continues to keep the case on his desk because it is the only one he cannot solve. He looks at the vintage boots in the evidence room and wonders how they could stay so clean and new. The valley is a place where the air stays still and the seasons do not follow the normal calendar cycles. Gideon Vance never went back to the mountains, and he never looked at another digital watch for his entire life. He preferred the steady ticking of an old mechanical clock that stayed in the present moment with him at home. The story of the disappearance is told in hushed tones by the residents of the nearby mountain town of Blackwood. They know that the woods are not just trees and rocks, but are a living part of the local Blackwood. The mystery is a gift for those who listen to the whispers of the wild and the hidden places now. The ending of the tale is the part you will remember when you are walking alone in the forest. The story is a circle, and the circle is a map, and the map leads back to the start. The truth is a fire that burns in the heart of the dark and the silence of the mountain. In this new story, true scary February snowstorm horror stories that still haunt survivors. In February 2012, 28-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne navigated the dense tree line of the Cascade Mountains alone. He was stationed at a remote outpost to monitor snowpack levels before a predicted record-breaking atmospheric river event occurred. Elias was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the physical risks of isolation during severe Pacific Northwest winter weather patterns daily. State records indicate that the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 hours as the massive storm front arrived. The sudden shift in pressure reportedly caused several electronic instruments inside the ranger station to malfunction without any logical warning. Investigators never confirmed why the emergency radio remained silent during the most critical hours of the initial freezing whiteout event. The wind outside reached 80 miles per hour, which stripped the thick bark from the ancient pine trees surrounding the cabin. Elias noted in his logs that the sound resembled human screaming, but he attributed this to the gale force wind. According to archive notes found later, he spent the evening reinforcing the heavy wooden shutters against the mounting heavy snow. Some locals claimed that this specific region was prone to strange acoustic anomalies during high-altitude pressure drops in winter. Records conflict regarding whether Elias was alone or if a secondary traveler had sought shelter at the station gate area. The county file from 2012 describes a series of heavy, rhythmic thuds against the reinforced front door that night. When the primary generator failed, Elias had to rely on a small kerosene lamp to maintain visibility inside the freezing room. He reportedly saw a figure standing motionless in the middle of the clearing through a small gap in the shutters. Dispatch logs show that no other rangers were within 50 miles of his location due to the extreme road conditions. The figure did not move for 4 hours despite the sub-zero temperatures and the blinding horizontal sheets of falling ice. Elias wrote that the person seemed to be wearing a summer uniform, which was logically impossible given the environment conditions. State records show that no missing persons reports were filed for that specific area during the month of February snows. By the morning of the second day, the snow had completely buried the first floor of the small mountain outpost building. Elias attempted to dig a tunnel toward the equipment shed, but he found the snow was packed with unnatural density. He discovered a set of barefoot prints leading away from his door into the center of the frozen forest floor. Investigators never confirmed how a human could survive those conditions without thermal gear or even basic leather winter boots today. The archive notes mentioned that Elias found his own name carved into the ice on the inside of the glass. There is no official explanation for how the frost formed into specific English characters during the peak of the storm. Elias spent the next 6 hours monitoring the barometer, which continued to drop into ranges rarely seen in Washington state history. He reportedly heard a series of voices whispering from the ventilation shafts despite being alone in a soundproof metal bunker. County files from 2012 indicate that the ranger station was designed to withstand much higher wind loads than recorded. Investigators never confirmed if the structural groaning was the result of the storm or something moving across the roof. Elias wrote in his final log entry that the shadow outside had moved closer to the thick, reinforced window pane. Some locals claimed that the pressure caused hallucinations, but the physical marks on the glass suggested a more solid presence. The search and rescue teams arrived 3 days later once the atmospheric river had finally moved toward the Idaho border. They found the station completely encased in a layer of black ice that required heavy industrial tools to break through. Dispatch logs show that the interior of the station was perfectly preserved, but Elias was nowhere to be found today. There were no signs of a struggle, and his cold weather gear was still hanging neatly by the kitchen stove. The county file from 2012 mentions that a single set of wet footprints led into the basement area alone. Records conflict on whether the basement door was locked from the inside or the outside when the team arrived. In February 2015, 24-year-old Sarah Miller was driving through the Oregon wilderness during a massive blizzard. She was a freelance journalist traveling to a small town to document the effects of the prolonged drought on locals. According to state records, Sarah was reported missing by her editor after she failed to check in from her hotel. Dispatch logs indicate that her vehicle was found abandoned on a Forest Service road that was not on any map. The car was running, and the heater was set to the highest possible temperature setting despite the empty driver's seat. Investigators never confirmed why she would leave a warm vehicle to walk into a blizzard without a heavy coat. The digital images on the camera showed a series of blurred shapes moving through the trees during the heavy snowfall. Some locals claimed that the shapes resembled tall, thin figures with elongated limbs that did not match any local wildlife. Archived notes from the investigation describe a strange humming sound that was captured on the final video file found later. Records conflict regarding the presence of footprints around the car because the wind had scoured the ground to the dirt. Sarah reportedly left a voicemail for her mother that consisted entirely of rhythmic tapping sounds in a specific sequence pattern. Investigators never confirmed if the tapping was a form of code or simply interference from the collapsing cell towers. A local hunter found a red scarf snagged on a branch near the summit of a peak called the Devil's Backbone. The county file from 2015 confirms that the scarf belonged to Sarah and was stained with strange gray ash. Some locals claimed that the area was a site of frequent magnetic disturbances that caused compasses to spin wildly today. Investigators never confirmed if Sarah had become disoriented by the whiteout conditions or if she was following a path. Archive notes mention that the search dogs refused to enter the dense thicket where the scarf was located that afternoon. State records show that the search was called off after 12 days due to another incoming storm system arriving. In February 2019, a group of 3 college students went missing while camping in the remote Appalachian Mountains area. They were 21-year-old Mark, 20-year-old Chloe, and 22-year-old David studying local geology. According to state records, they had obtained a permit to collect rock samples from a specific limestone cave system there. Dispatch logs show that their last communication was a text message sent to a friend at midnight on Friday night. The message reportedly contained only a single word, which was the name of a town that no longer existed today. Investigators never confirmed how the students reached the deep interior of the forest, given the deep snowdrifts present. Inside the tent, investigators found 3 sets of sleeping bags that had been arranged in a perfect triangle formation tonight. Records conflict on whether the students had time to put on their boots before fleeing into the freezing night air. Some locals claimed that the limestone caves acted as a natural amplifier for subsonic frequencies that caused intense panic attacks. Archive notes from the search team state that they heard the sound of children laughing deep within the rock walls. Investigators never confirmed the source of the laughter since there were no families living within 20 miles of the site. State records show that David's glasses were found resting on a ledge 50 feet above the ground level, clearly. By the time the snow melted in April, a hiker discovered a backpack hanging from a high branch near cave. The backpack contained a journal with entries that stopped abruptly on the night the storm began in February 2019. The final page contained a detailed drawing of a face with no eyes or mouth looking through a window glass. Some locals claimed that this image matched old folklore stories from the region about the entities of the frost. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the person who drew the image since the handwriting was completely illegible today. The county file from 2019 remains one of the most mysterious disappearances in the history of the park. In this news story, true creepy road trip horror stories that happened on cold February nights. The winter weather in the northern United States often creates a sense of isolation that affects the psychological state of many lone travelers. Road trips during the month of February are reportedly documented by state records as being the most dangerous due to unpredictable ice and wind. Most drivers who find themselves stranded on desolate highways claim that the silence of the frozen landscape is more unsettling than the cold itself. These individuals often report seeing figures or vehicles that do not appear in any official law enforcement logs or local county registry files. The following accounts are compiled from archive notes and dispatch logs that detail several strange encounters on the American road during the winter freeze. The empty stretch of Highway 50 near Ely, Nevada, reportedly remains one of the most desolate corridors in the lower 48 states. In 1994, a 22-year-old graduate student named Marcus was driving his sedan toward a research site in the desert. He was a biological researcher tasked with collecting soil samples during the late winter freeze for a university-funded environmental study in 1994. Marcus intended to reach the town of Austin before the temperature dropped below zero that night, but his vehicle began to lose power. The silence of the Great Basin during February is documented in state records as being particularly oppressive to lone travelers in the region. Marcus guided his slowing car onto the narrow gravel shoulder while the surrounding darkness swallowed the remaining light of his dim yellow headlights is less than has-hone. Zero hash is greater than. Investigators never confirmed the exact nature of the mechanical failure that left the sedan immobilized against the frozen sagebrush and the deep snow. Marcus checked his dispatch logs and realized he was outside the range of the nearest transmission tower, which was located several miles away. Some locals claimed that the wind in that region creates auditory illusions that sound like human voices calling from the darkness of the trees. He reportedly sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes while the interior heat of the car escaped through the thin glass windows. The archive notes from the county sheriff department mention a single set of footprints that appeared to circle the vehicle several times. Marcus reportedly felt the car rock gently as if someone were testing the weight of the rear bumper in the freezing midnight air. County files from 1994 indicate that a second vehicle was spotted by a local rancher moving slowly without any lights on. The rancher was a 60-year-old man named Elias, who was out checking his livestock near the perimeter fence of his pasture. He told authorities that a dark truck was idling in the middle of the pavement nearly 50 yards behind the stranded sedan of Marcus. Elias noted that the driver of the truck did not exit the vehicle or offer any assistance to the young man stuck in the snow. State records conflict regarding whether this truck was ever registered to anyone living within a 100-mile radius of the Ely region. The rancher stayed in his own vehicle and watched as the mysterious truck slowly turned its wheels toward the shoulder where Marcus sat is less than his own. Zero hash is greater than. Marcus reportedly noticed the shape of the larger vehicle in his rearview mirror and assumed it was a highway patrol officer arriving to help. He stepped out into the bitter cold of the February night and felt the wind chill bite through his heavy winter coat and gloves. The young researcher waved his arms to signal his position, but the approaching truck did not flash its lights or sound its horn. Investigators later found archive notes suggesting that the truck accelerated suddenly once Marcus was standing vulnerable on the open road in the darkness. He allegedly dove back into his sedan and locked the doors while the larger vehicle brushed against the side of his car door. The impact left a long streak of dark paint that remained unidentified during the subsequent investigation by the local county file agents. Records from the dispatch logs show that a frantic emergency call was placed from a nearby ranch house approximately 40 minutes after the encounter. Marcus had reportedly fled his vehicle on foot through the knee-deep snow to reach the lights of the Elias Ranch across the valley. He arrived with severe frostbite on his fingers and claimed that the dark truck had followed him at a walking pace for 2 miles. Some locals claimed that the truck belonged to a transient worker who had been seen in the area during the winter of 1992. However, the investigators never confirmed the identity of the driver or the location of the truck after it turned off the main road. The cold February air allegedly kept the tracks of the mysterious vehicle preserved in the ice for several weeks after the incident is less than has-hone. Zero hash is greater than. A similar event was documented in 2011 near the town of Speculator in the Adirondack Mountains of New York during a heavy storm. A 35-year-old nurse named Sarah was traveling home from a double shift at a regional hospital located in the northern woods. Her goal was to reach her cabin before the freezing rain turned the winding mountain passes into sheets of black ice and stone. Sarah reportedly saw a figure standing in the center of the road wearing a bright yellow raincoat that seemed out of place. State records from 2011 describe multiple reports of a hitchhiker matching this description appearing on various nights throughout that specific February. She slowed her vehicle to avoid a collision, but the figure did not move or acknowledge the presence of her heavy SUV. The nurse later told investigators that the person in the yellow coat had no visible face behind the shadow of the hood and rain. She reportedly drove around the figure and watched in her mirror as the person began to run with incredible speed behind her car. Archive notes from the state police mention that Sarah reached speeds of 60 miles per hour on the ice to escape the individual. The records conflict on how a person on foot could maintain such a pace on a surface that was nearly impossible to walk. Some locals claimed the figure was a known prankster from the nearby village, but no one ever stepped forward to claim the responsibility. Sarah reportedly reached her cabin and stayed inside with a loaded shotgun until the sun rose over the frozen peaks the next day, is less than Hassan. Zero hash is greater than. In 2003, a long-haul trucker named Robert was navigating the icy passes of the Cascade Mountains in the state of Washington. He was a 48-year-old driver with 20 years of experience transporting heavy machinery across the northern border of the United States. Robert was behind schedule due to a massive snowstorm that had closed several primary routes through the mountain range during early February. He was forced to take a secondary logging road that was rarely plowed by the state road crews during the peak of winter. The dispatch logs from his trucking company indicate that he checked in at 11 o'clock at night to report heavy fog conditions. Robert reportedly saw a pair of headlights appearing in his side mirror that seemed to be maintaining a very consistent distance behind him. The truck driver noticed that the following vehicle was not using its high beams despite the total lack of visibility on the narrow road. He slowed down to let the other driver pass, but the vehicle behind him also decreased its speed to match his own pace. Robert reportedly used his radio to contact any other drivers in the area, but he received only static and distant white noise. Archived notes from the State Patrol show that no other commercial vehicles were authorized to be on that specific road that evening. He grew concerned when the following vehicle began to weave back and forth across the center line of the snowy logging path. The county file from 2003 contains a statement from Robert describing the vehicle as a vintage black limousine from the 50s is less than Hashown. Zero hash is greater than. Investigators never confirmed the presence of a vintage limousine in the region because there were no registration records for such a car in Washington. Robert reportedly saw the driver of the limousine pull alongside his massive truck while they were navigating a sharp turn over a steep cliff. He claimed that the interior of the car was filled with a thick green light that obscured the features of the person driving. The truck driver forced his vehicle into a higher gear and managed to pull away from the mysterious car on a straight stretch. Some locals claimed that an old hotel at the top of the pass used to operate a fleet of similar cars in 1950. Robert reached the main highway and found that the black car had vanished into the swirling snow without leaving any tire tracks. Another account from 1988 involves a young couple named David and Linda who were driving through the rural hills of Kentucky. They were both 24-year-old teachers who were traveling to visit family for a winter wedding during the first week of February. David was driving their small hatchback while Linda consulted a paper map because they had become lost on the back roads near Owsley. The state records from 1988 indicate that a series of strange sightings occurred in that county during the same winter month. They reportedly encountered a roadblock consisting of several large wooden crates that had been placed across the width of the narrow pavement. David stopped the car and remained inside while he waited for someone to appear and explain the obstruction in the freezing road is less than #. Zero hash is greater than. Linda reportedly saw several figures moving through the thick brush on the side of the road while they sat in their idling car. The figures were described in archive notes as being extremely tall and wearing dark clothing that blended into the shadows of the trees. David decided to put the car in reverse and turn around rather than getting out to move the heavy wooden crates himself. He told investigators that the figures began to throw large rocks at the vehicle, which shattered the rear window of the hatchback. They fled the area at high speed and reported the incident to the local sheriff office once they reached a gas station. Some locals claimed that a group of survivalists had been living in the woods and did not want any outsiders on the road. The county file from 1988 shows that deputies went to the location but found no crates and no footprints in the snow. Investigators never confirmed who had placed the obstacles or why the figures had attacked the couple during their quiet road trip in February. David and Linda refused to travel through that part of Kentucky again, and their story was eventually filed away in the cold cases. Records conflict regarding whether the rocks found in the car were local limestone or something that had been brought from a different region. The couple reportedly suffered from night terrors for several years following the event, but they never found any logical explanation for the encounter. Most state records from that era remain sealed or have been lost due to a fire in the county archives building. A final report from 2015 describes a lone traveler named Thomas who was driving through the plains of North Dakota in winter. Thomas was a 50-year-old insurance adjuster who was traveling between remote farms to inspect damage from a recent blizzard in February. He reportedly found himself on a stretch of road where the snow had drifted so high that it formed white walls on either side. Dispatch logs indicate that he called his office to say that he was seeing a house in the middle of the road. Thomas claimed that the house was fully lit and looked like it belonged in a suburban neighborhood rather than a snowy field. Archive notes suggest that he stopped his car and watched as the front door of the house slowly opened in the wind. Thomas reportedly saw a woman standing in the doorway who was wearing a summer dress and holding a glass of iced tea in her hand. He stayed in his car because the temperature outside was 10 degrees below zero, and the scene did not make any logical sense. The woman waved at him and began to walk toward his vehicle across the deep snow without wearing any shoes or a coat. Investigators never confirmed the existence of a house in that location, as the land was part of a protected wildlife refuge area. Thomas drove his car into the snowbank to get around the woman and did not look back until he reached town. Some locals claimed that heat exhaustion or extreme cold can cause vivid hallucinations that look exactly like the memories of home. The state records from 2015 show that Thomas was found 3 hours later sitting in his car at a local diner. He was in a state of shock and his vehicle had no signs of damage despite his claim of driving through a snowbank. The archive notes from the hospital mentioned that his body temperature was normal and there were no signs of drugs or alcohol. Investigators checked the road where he had been driving, but they found only an empty field covered in a smooth layer of ice. Records conflict on whether Thomas ever returned to his job as an insurance adjuster after the strange encounter in the North Dakota plains. Many people believe that the February cold creates a thin spot in reality where the past and present begin to overlap.